should have my PowerPoint up there, gardening from a beekeeper's perspective. And I should say it's my perspective. You know, I'm I wouldn't consider myself an expert or a master beekeeper. I'm certainly not a master beekeeper. I've only been doing it for 30 something years. And some days I feel like I'm learning. Some days I feel like I know a little bit less than when I started. But so these are my thoughts about things that I've seen and that I've observed in my beehives and in our garden and in the world around here in New York State. So let me see if I can figure out how to do this. So as John said, I'm a filmmaker by profession. I've been a cameraman, cinematographer for many, many years, and a beekeeper for many years. And I also grow flowers and vegetables, mushrooms, trees, shrubs. We have a very active kind of place here, and even have worms. I started worms this past year. So I'm a person of many hobbies and a lot of interests, and I don't sit around very well. So that's what how this all works for me. And let me see, there we go. So I guess what I really wanted to talk about is what I kind of wonder myself all the time is how we fit into the natural world. I mean, we're visitors here. We're only here for a limited amount of time. And so I'm constantly thinking about how do we work with nature and the creatures that are around us. And particularly through gardening, you know, we have so many choices about whether we garden and how we garden and what we do with those gardens. And a lot of those choices, because of my different interests, you know, I thought about this from a beekeeper's perspective and what bees need, what I think that bees need. So that's sort of where it's coming from. The obvious thing is that beekeepers and bees need flowers, which can also be on trees and shrubs. But gardeners also need bees. If you grow vegetables, you're not going to get anything if you do not have pollination. And I always recommend when new beekeepers come to me, and I have mentored a bunch of people over the years, that, you know, if you're going to start keeping bees, it's not putting a box out in the backyard. You have to work at it. It takes a fair amount of work and continual knowledge to try and understand honeybees. But then also you need to create forage, in my opinion. You need to create this forage for them throughout the year. And it's beautiful for us too. And that's why I love it. I grew up, my parents were gardeners, my grandparents were gardeners. And so I grew up with a shovel in my hand, so to speak. And I just get endless pleasure out of doing it. And work at it, you know, as much as I can. It's where I find solace and relaxation, is out in the garden. And so just a couple of primary things out here. Pollination, if anybody doesn't know what that is what you need to make a plant reproduce. And this is a great drawing that my friend Wendy Hollander did for an education guide that we did for the film The Pollinators. And we're really thrilled that she was able to do this. And if you don't know Wendy's work, she's just an amazing world-class botanical illustrator. So basically, it's pollination is moving the male bits to the female bits. And sometimes that all happens in the same flower, but sometimes you need a different flower or you need a different plant in order for that to happen. And if you don't have it, you don't get pollination. And so pollination is really important, particularly if you're growing things that you want to eat or as a farmer, because if you don't have complete pollination, you're not going to have a crop. And sometimes you'll see it in the store stands or whatever, you'll see a misshapen cucumber or collapsed strawberry or something like that. And that is usually an indication of incomplete pollination, because bees have to make, for many things, many plants, they have to make multiple trips back to the same flower in order to get pollination. And it's not just bees, of course. So the other type of pollination is wind pollination, and that's most of the grass crops that we have around. The corn is wind pollinated, and wheat, rice, but also pine trees and some of the other trees. The pollen literally blows off the tree or off the plant and needs to find another one. And just a little thing, it's kind of a primary thing, but a lot of people don't think about it. But when you see the tassel on an ear of corn, every one of those threads needed in order to form that kernel, pollen needed to get down into that nascent ear of corn. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about, that all those things are connected to each one of those corn kernels, which is in fact the seed. So most of the stuff that we eat, the really good stuff for us, is pollinated by insects. And like I think there are 400 different fruits and nuts in our common diet that are pollinated by insects, and it's kind of a mutual beneficial opportunity. The pollen is something the bees need, and they collect that. They usually don't collect honeybees, don't collect pollen and nectar at the same time. But if you look carefully, you can see a bee that is uh, collecting pollen because they have these little saddlebags on their rear two legs, and they have little different colored pollen depending on what it is. And then nectar is a way that plants attract the pollinator, whether it's a hummingbird or butterfly or honeybee or any one of the other types of bees. And so it's kind of a necessary relationship there. And we need them. We need we need all these bees and insects to do it. And it's not just the pollinating insects. We need the ants and the other things because they clean up after they take away the detritus, and they're the sweepers, if you will, or the food for larger creatures like caterpillars may be a nuisance, but those are food for birds. So it's I always trying to think about like annoying insects. They have a role in our ecosystems, and so it's kind of interesting to think about what that role may be when a mosquito is biting you. But that's there is a role out there for them. So in terms of like what is really beneficial for bees from a gardening perspective, this is to plant a diverse crop of different types of flowers, but to plant in little clusters, because bees, they typically don't like to go here and then not find another one of those same flowers right nearby, or if they have to go to something else. That's not a very effective way for bees to gather nectar or pollen. And it's something I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's called, honeybees do this thing called flower fidelity, which means that if they're out on clover, they will be out on clover and they won't go clover dandelion. Typically, it might happen every once in a while, but typically they will go clover, 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 or dandelion, dandelion, dandelion. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. And so planting in clusters is a very useful and beneficial thing for the bees to gather food. And it's great. It's a beautiful design. These are our gardens at the Stone Ridge Library right up the road. I think Barbara Lawrence is on the call. Those are two images from her house that Garden Makers did. And Deb Gray and her crew are just really amazing gardeners from an aesthetic standpoint. And then also they think about what they're planting and what the benefit it might have for the environment. Now, of course, not everything you'll see typically, in an organized garden, there'll be grasses and things that are not necessarily flowering plants. And that's just part of the design for, shape and balance and aesthetics, really. There's sort of somebody told me recently that there's a general rule of 1/3, 2/3, 2/3 flower, 1/3 kind of non-flowering shapes and colors and textures in the garden, which is kind of interesting. There are no hard, fast rules with any of this, of course, but it's just interesting to stop and think about how it all goes together. So there's so much diversity in the bee world, and honeybees are just one type of pollinators that we have here in New York and the world, actually. But their flies are actually the number 2 pollinator, of the insect world. And then also butterflies, I'm sure everybody sees those, but beetles and birds, hummingbirds gather pollen when they hit some flowers and then move it along on their beak as they go from flower to flower. So they assist to that as well. And we in New York have 417, give or take, species of different types of bees. Most of them are not living in colonies. They live in the ground or some other type of nest arrangement or wood, or places like that. And they're solitary, meaning that they don't have a gigantic hive or colony like we think of a honeybee, which may have tens of thousands of bees in it. But they're solitary, meaning that they emerge in the spring, they come out, they mate, and then they start working to lay eggs. The queen will lay eggs and raise young that'll come out the next year. And they do that in many different ways. It's kind of fascinating, the different sort of mechanisms that bees use. So it's really important to have that. Oops, let me see. Yeah, and this is just another sorry, my nose had the itch there. Just another image of some of the other bees, and these are all images that I've grabbed in our backyard and right around the corner here. I think that, you know, if you stop and look at some of these flowers and take a long look at them, you can see the incredible beauty and diversity in shapes and colors and function that that all these insects have. I mean, especially the top center one, the little green sweat bee, is you know, is about the size of a grain of rice. And so I think it's kind of fun. I find myself doing that, just standing in the garden and just looking and seeing what I see, you know, seeing what I don't notice right away. Because if you stand there and look, a lot of times, you know, something will reveal itself to you. Honeybees, the ubiquitous honeybee, is not native to North America. They were introduced by the first Europeans here, and they brought them over to pollinate the seeds that they brought with them from Europe, and they went feral right away. And back then, they, you know, in the colonial times or pre-colonial times, the honeybee was used for wax for sealing, honey, of course, for as a sweetener, and then for pollination of the seeds and crops that they brought with them. It turned out that they liked it here a lot, and they went feral, and so they're spread as colonists spread across North America. Honeybees usually preceded them, and it was one of the first things I read that that the explorers or settlers would look for. They would beeline a bee and try and find a hive in a tree, because that would give them a source of sweetener and sealing and everything else. So it's very useful, and they just you know, they've just gone very comfortable here on the landscape. Interestingly enough, honeybees are the only insect in the world that makes a food that we can eat, and that, of course, is honey. And so that's kind of a unique arrangement. They also are manageable. I should have put a question mark in there, because as a beekeeper, I question whether they're manageable, because they are wild creatures. They're movable in hives and on trucks, as you see in the bottom there. And whether that's good or bad, that's another whole other conversation. But the ability that they can scale up very quickly to a population of 60,000 honeybee queen this time of year will be able to lay 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day, and so they can really scale up very, very quickly, and which makes it very useful for the problems that beekeepers have been having with 40% or better losses, that they can divide and recover their bees fairly quickly, although it's not ideal to do that. So they're great for agriculture. They are that's the other film that I did that we mentioned, called the Pollinators. That's really what that film is about bees and our food system. If you want to watch something longer, if you haven't seen it. But interestingly enough, they're farmers. If you have enough native plants or diverse crops that you grow, a variety of things, you might have enough, depending on the size of your farm, you might have enough native bees that will do the job for you. The reason why they move honeybees is not because the beekeepers want to drive around. It's because the changes in agriculture have really demanded that. Because in the bottom, I guess the center picture, you see that's almond crops, and that's you know, 1 million acres of almonds out in the Central Valley of California. And once the almond bloom is gone, there's not much else for the bees to eat. So their necessity is to bring in honeybees by the truckload. So they'll bring in a couple of million beehives every year strictly for the almond pollination, and then they'll take them off to another place. But that's what the film The Pollinators is about, if you want to see that. So more about bees, and what's interesting is that bees, one of many things that's interesting is that bees separated from wasps. They sort of split, had an evolutionary split back 120 million years ago, give or take a few million years. And wasps get a lot of their protein from carrion and cleaning up, attacking other insects, cleaning up dead insects, and other sources like that. Bees figured out evolutionarily that they could get that protein from pollen. And so with plants, they sort of co-evolved from the first flowering plants. Bees were there and they made that change with them. And then you stop and you think about all the literally millions of different types of flowers that we have and all the different types of bees that have evolved with them. It's kind of mind-boggling. And it's this incredibly symbiotic relationship. It's a very mutually beneficial because the plant gets something, the pollination, and the bees get something, they get their nutrition. And so like many other things, it's just a real solid give and take. And that down on the bottom right, that's a cranberry flower, which I found to be one of the most beautiful flowers. You rarely see it because you have to be in a cranberry bog to see it, but it looks like a little lily to me, and I just love that. And again, these are pictures from from around, not cranberries from around here, obviously, but over near where Kim lives. And but the rest of these are all right around here. So what do bees need? As a gardener, what they need is habitat, and that varies depending on what the type of bee it is. But most importantly, they need floral resources throughout a season. Bees come out, they respond to the weather. So if we have a very early warm February, you're going to have bees that are going to come out, and they're going to look for something to eat right away. And so those very early crops, very early flowers are really important. So those snowdrops and crocuses and maples can be very, very, very important when we start to see the bees. They're going to come out and they're going to need something to eat. So having something early and then something late is really, really, really important. This is the time of year here that bees are starting to wind down a little bit. My indicator is always when I see the goldenrod coming in. That's the last significant big nectar opportunity for them in this region. And so that's always an indicator to me that the end of the year is creeping towards us. They need to have water. Bees need water, and so if you have a garden, putting a little shallow pan out for bees or some sort of place where they can get water is really, really, really important. But they will drown if occasionally. I don't mean to laugh about that, but they will drown sometimes if it's too deep. And so like what I do is put a little float in there for them, to a little raft, if you will, or a rock that they can climb up on and get out. And they have the different types of bees have a completely different range. So it could be a couple of 100 feet to a honeybee will fly 5 or 6 miles to get nutrition. But they only have to, as a beekeeper once told me, the honeybee will only fly as far as it has to go. So if you have stuff locally, that's where they're going to go. And because they don't want to expend the energy to go flying around looking for something that's right outside their door, which is why it's really important to create a lot of floral resources for them. You don't have to have a gigantic property. That's the upper left is the Ulster County Community College demonstration gardens, and the one below that as well. You don't have to have a gigantic property to have forage and flowers for bees. You can do it in pots, window boxes or pots on your deck or whatever, whether it's vegetables or flowers. All of that makes a difference. And it's really kind of creating this sort of tapestry or quilt, if you will, a mosaic of places where bees can move from one place to another. And because they have to expand, they want to expand. And so by creating these different pathways or connections for them, corridors, if you will, that's really important to help them out. And of course, pesticides and herbicides are a real problem for bees. Pesticides that they use even on corn, even though it's not something that bees get into necessarily, because it is wind blown, wind pollinated. It blows a lot of times. You'll get it onto squash plants, and then squash plants, the bees will pick it up and they'll bring it back to their hive, so they can inadvertently get poisoned that way. So pesticides, I'm not anti-pesticide 100%, but I just think that we have to use them very carefully, and we in this country tend to use them way too liberally, I think, and we use them before we even know we have a problem. That upper right picture, that's right on Main Street, Accord. That's the little next to the Ackford Market. And I just love the wild nature of that little antique shop, and what they have going on there. And then there's another image from the Stone Ridge Library in the bottom left. And then the one in the sort of right center, that's a pollinator strip on along 209 in Hurley. So bees, a couple of things that's interesting about them is they see in the UV, and I have a typo there, in a UV spectrum. So they see flowers, they look differently to them. Bees don't see red, or honeybees don't see red anyway, but they do see UV. So that might look like the dahlia. I see honeybees on my dahlias. That might look like black with a yellow target in it. And so if you look at how flowers look in UV, a lot of times it does look like a target, and it's kind of interesting to think about that. They also have incredible sense of smell. So I know when I'm extracting honey, I'm out there for less than a minute before other bees can smell that honey being extracted, and they're trying to get at it. And floral fidelity, what I talked about a minute ago, is the idea that bees collect from different clover, or dandelion, or monarda. And same thing with pollen and nectar. They try and have that flower fidelity, which is just kind of interesting. Scout bees go out every morning. They orient themselves to the sun, and then they set out and they look to see what's in bloom. And then they'll come back and tell the rest of the hive in their own way, called the waggle dance, where they communicate based on the sun, how far it is, where it is, and what it is. And they communicate that, and that's how they will, if they find a patch of clover that just came into bloom, they're going to tell the rest of their hive mates about that. And then you'll start to see other bees, heading over there to find it. Timing of flowers is kind of interesting, because it's something I learned when I made the other film, The Pollinators, is that certain flowers, they're receptive, if you will, for pollination certain times. So like squash flowers, you'll only typically see bees on there in the morning because they are available for pollination. Maybe it's the release of nectar, I'm not exactly sure. But there's certain flowers, they're available for pollination at certain times. And then also, if you've ever wondered why you see a blueberry bush, and we'll see a blueberry bush coming up, why you can have flowers and blueberries on the same plant at the same time, is that it's a way that nature and the plant can ensure cross-pollination, so that they know that all their flowers won't get pollinated at one time, and they'll get a diversity of insects that do it, and it'll spread out until you get that pollination from other plants. So you have this, you don't have this genetic, I guess, inbreeding is the way to put it. So pollinator pathways and habitats is something, it's a fairly new thing. The town of Rochester is a brand new member of this, and I congratulate you guys for doing that. They've established a pollinator garden at Town Hall just this year. And pollinator pathway is doing basically just what I've been talking about, trying to use native plants to extend these connective gardens and connective habitats and floral resources. And it's a national endeavor, and there are plenty of places right around here that are part of the pollinator pathway, so to speak. It's all volunteer run. Many towns right around here in Ulster County. SUNY Uck in Stone Ridge is a member of that. In our town, New Paltz, and I can't list them all, but there are a ton of them. And the pollinator strip that is the top left there, that's on 209 again by the rail trail there. And that's I was happy to see that the DOT was doing that one, which is great. And I'm happy to see that they were not out there spraying herbicide like they did years ago. And then there are organizations. I have a resource list that I'm going to share later on. There are organizations that really work on getting these messages out and getting people involved in this. And a couple of them are Xerces Society, Bee City USA, Bee Campus USA. SUNY New Paltz is a bee campus, and it means that they have to go through a lengthy application period, but then they have to commit to having a certain amount of pollinator habitat. And then also they have to do a certain amount of educational programs every year before they to keep that designation. And so it's a fantastic thing. So they have a rotating crew of people at SUNY New Paltz who do that. So we talked a little bit about habitat, but that could vary, of course, depending on the bee species. Of course, honeybees live in beehives, or they'll live in a tree, or hopefully not your barn, but they will live wherever they can find a good space. But other bees, some of the solitary bees, will dig holes in the ground, and they'll live in the ground. Stalks in your garden, it's a great thing to leave the stalks up. Don't clip them back, because that's habitat for certain bees. They'll get in there, they'll lay eggs and set up house in those empty stalks. So it's good to use care and timing on that. It's more beneficial to bees to have a little sloppier garden in that regard. Wood, I'm sure most people have encountered carpenter bees. And then also bumblebees. I've found numerous bumblebee nests in old mouse nests on our property. They just, walking along, and I'll just hear a little bit of a buzz, and I'll sort of sort it out and try and figure out what it is, and uncover under a bunch of fluff a little bumblebee colony. And they're semi, they're bigger colonies. They can be from 50 to a couple hundred bumblebees in a nest. They're not like really a gigantic organism or organization like honeybees, but they're not solitary either. So they're kind of a sort of a hybrid. And so it's important to leave that habitat for them, leaving a little bare patch of dirt or whatever. That's our friend's house on the bottom there. And again, that's a garden that's done by garden makers. And they've done a great job with just creating habitat there with the dirt and the stone and the stalks. And it's just alive with bees. I was over there the other day. The pollinator meadow on the bottom, I would urge people to go over to check out what they have going on over at Uck, right by the traffic circle in Stone Ridge. And the top one is just is the end of our road. It's right off Towpath Road here. It's just a beautiful habitat. I looked at that and I thought, well, that's fantastic. It's just, there's so much going on there in terms of bees and floral resources. Speaking of floral resources, so again, what we need to try and think about as a beekeeper is, what are those floral resources, and how can we try and help that? And then, like, one of the first things around here that people don't even know flowers are maple trees. The red maple is a big source of nectar and pollen for the early emerging bees. Of course, we don't see the flowers because they're up on the top of the trees. It's a tiny little flower, kind of inconspicuous before the leaves come out. But there are many, many, many different types of trees and shrubs and plants that we can introduce or foster in our environments that are going to be good for bees. Again, I have a list at the end of this that I'll share with people, or people can email me and I'll send it to you. Just some suggestions of different things. I have an approximately 6A for our plant hardiness here. That's what it's listed as, but as we all know, weather and climate is changing rapidly. We used to be a 5A, and that's changed over the last 15 years. And so that's just a ballpark window of where we are in terms of the zone here. And on the bottom right, that's an example of blueberries and blueberry flowers on the same plant at the same time. And then the bottom left, I'll just say a thing about that. That's actually an invasive. That's Japanese knotweed, which is an invasive and not very well liked by many people. But beekeepers kind of dig it because it's a great honey. If you can get knotweed honey, it's also called bamboo honey. It's very tasty. It's alive with bees, but it is invasive. So to me, it's a good example of, there's no one thing that you can say is good or bad. Maybe barberry is bad. I don't know, or stilt grass. I don't know. But sometimes these things have mixed blessings. That's an almond flower in the center there, center bottom, and apples in the center right. So diversity, just like us, bees need diversity. Not that we're going to count the calories of different the nutritional quality of of pollen, but there is different nutrition for different flowers. We can't figure that out. Bees will know what to do, but that's why having a lot of different types of flowers is going to be really good. And again, we go back to the monoculture idea, and that's not great for bees. When you think about a bee that's living on an almond pollen, almond nectar diet, it's kind of like eating a Hershey bar every day of the week. And so having that, there have been studies that have been done about the nutritional value of pollen and nectar, and the diversity is really, really, really important, because they get not only the pollen and nectar, but all the amino acids and other things that come through that nectar and with that pollen, and it leads to healthier bees. But it's a matter of taste and preference. Sometimes, if you're doing a garden design, having a grass in there, an ornamental grass, or some other type of flower that is for shape and color and texture, is fine. And like, if you look at that center picture on the left, irises, that's a scarlet runner bean, and then on the bottom of that picture is pulmonaria. And pulmonaria is a beautiful early season flower, but it's gone by May, and it's really, bees love it, but it goes away, and it's just there for a shape for later in the year. So that's all part of the choices that we make when we're doing gardens. There's some things that are like, that have been ornamental and cultivars of different types of bulbs. I'm sure everybody has seen these double frilly daffodils. They look fantastic and they're wonderful, but a lot of those cultivars, bees don't have the mechanics to get to the nectar or get to the pollen, and so they may look good, and I'm not totally against those, because we do have some of those. They look great, but they're not ideal for bees. So it's just something to think about, and those are the things that we all have to decide, and do our own research, as they say, about what you're planting. And so one of the things that I'm very much interested in is this idea of, where does a garden end? And the next slide will be, where does the lawn end? So this is our yard here next to the garden. We have it filled with daffodils in the spring. They go away, and I mow them down after the greens have died back. But it's that transitional thing. The bees love it, and it looks great. And so me personally, I don't really, I like that idea of those transitional spaces where it's not a hard divide like an English formal garden, but that's just my preference. I love this field on the upper right. That's right down by the Rochester Reformed Church there. And that is just alive with pollinators this time of year. It's just a weedy field, but it's not weedy. If you stand there and look, it's amazing how many different insects are in there, and deer and birds and everything else are alive in there. The bottom right is chicory, which by many people is a roadside weed. It's kind of pretty, but it's also a great source for bumblebees, and I see them on it all the time. So kind of, some of these things I don't know, it's a choice to have them or not have them, to cut them down, not to cut them down. Bottom center is one of my favorites. That's called mountain mint, and I don't remember the particular variety, but that's an amazing plant. If you had to have one plant growing wild in your yard, mountain mint would be great, because it spreads, and it's just alive with. I was out looking at ours the other day, and it had easily a dozen different types of insects, from tiny little bees to wasps to butterflies on it. So it's just crazy good. And then, where does the lawn begin? This is another thing that lawns, to me, is something that I think we need to rethink about. The idea, the sort of social economic thing, that's a whole film in itself about lawns and what we do when we're having a lawn. But they're a gigantic monoculture in the United States. They don't have a lot of benefit for bees. They're great to walk on and everything else, but it's just kind of a giant monoculture of perennial grasses. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the No Mow May campaign, which is an informal campaign about letting your lawn grow and letting things like that plantain on the upper top, on the top left, grow, and clover. And you just say, it's funny, I got entertainment this year. I'm easily entertained by watching bees land on those and then swing back and forth, as they're gathering pollen off them. And they're just great. So our lawn is not exactly what you would call tidy. I mow it when I get to that point where I can't mow it any, if I mow it, then I'll have to mow it 3 times, and that's kind of ineffective. So I kind of walk that line, but I tend to mow. I think I've mowed twice this year, maybe, yeah, twice this year. So, and then you can add things to it. You can add clover. The clover, the 2 top right pictures are in our yard, and we added clover when we planted grass. So there's flowering resources in there amongst the grasses. The bottom one is thyme. I took that up by the reservoir, the walking path up by the reservoir, and it just says beautiful. I heard the bees, and I looked down. It's like right next to them. The walking path in the grass was this thyme, which is fantastic. And you can always cut a path if you want to walk around on grass. You can cut paths. But I think that lawns are one of those things that I think we just need to reconsider a little bit, and not have that Levittown kind of ideology with it. And if you do let it grow, you're going to see the bees and butterflies and birds come back and use it. And it's interesting, when we have our lawn high, we have certain birds that feed off insects on the lawn, and then when we cut it low, we have different birds that come and feed off the insects on the lawn. So it depends on which birds they are and how they're doing. I'm going to move along because I know I'm blathering. It's what happens when beekeepers start talking. So public space gardens, I'm really interested in this area. Again, that's up on the top center. That's the rail trail, and then the Stone Ridge Garden. And these are great opportunities to make a welcoming space, but also have a beneficial space for bees, and then also for us humans. And it's a great place to meet people and talk about all this stuff. I talked about water before. There's a little bowl that we have, a stone bowl that we have on our, and it's out by our garden. I fill it up every day or so, every other day. And some days when it's really hot and dry, like last year, it looked like a watering hole around, in the Serengeti. It was amazing with all the different insects in there. And so what I'm interested in things is this idea about ecosystems. We all have these ecosystems at our homes, and each yard can really be its own ecosystem. And by doing that, you're going to attract birds and bees and other insects, and as well as animals. That wood turtle, or the box turtle, excuse me, has come back every year since we've been here, right around the same time. It wanders around for about a week until it finds a place to lay some eggs. And I know it's the same turtle because I photograph it, and I can identify the specific markings on that turtle because they're all unique. And I can identify that same turtle comes back every year, which to me is kind of an indication that it's happy here. So I like little indications like that. And again, avoiding pesticides and herbicides is key to having this, because the downstream effect of all of those things is not good. And having a lot of birds, if you have a good balanced system, the birds will eat a lot of the pests, and from ticks to caterpillars. I read somewhere this year that chickadees, when they're raising the young, will eat thousands of caterpillars, which is kind of mind-boggling. So there you go. That's this is all food for thought, so to speak. And I would never tell anybody what to do with their garden or with their yard, but this is my own view and what we're trying to strive for here. And just the idea that we want to try and improve our soils, because the soils are important to this. The basis of all of this is healthy soil, and the idea that every insect has a role here. And so the idea that I really want to leave people with is the idea that go wild. I love the transitions from a garden, whatever you call a garden, into a wild space, the edge of the woods. And if you let things, you go out and you see these very ephemeral and yet beautiful wildflowers, and you see something like that trillium that is being pollinated by an insect. I don't even know what pollinates it, but it's an insect that's native, because they have that give and take and relationship that that mutually supports themselves. And I love discovering these flowers and see what is visiting them and how beautiful they are. Even a thistle, right? They're very ordinary, and a lot of people look at that and say it's a weed. And I look at it, that's a weed to me is a plant that has a PR problem for most of the cases. And I look at that and I say, if we didn't have those thistles, we wouldn't have that monarch. That monarch would be missing a meal. So just something to think about. And that, finally, I'll just leave with that this is a lifelong pursuit. If you want to get into gardening or want to get into beekeeping, I will warn you, it is addictive to be a beekeeper. And they're perpetual works in progress. I've never had a garden that is finished. I'm always thinking about it as I see how it comes up every year. What am I going to do next year? What am I going to plant next year? How did that work? Maybe if I move it, it'll do better. Or, if I have something that can be a companion to it or whatever. And gardeners, like beekeepers, I've always found to be very generous with their knowledge and very generous with plants. And so it's a great way to meet people, and you have this common bond of growing something. And with kids, we have kids come over here, grandkids of friends of ours and visitors, and it's so fun to watch them go out into our garden on the bottom there and just taste things and see things and pick things and just get that connection, that lifelong connection, and wonder about how the magic of a seed and can yield to a cherry tomato this time of year. And it's just, you can see those light bulbs going off on all their heads, and it's what happened to me when I was a kid, and it's still stuck. So what I love to do is to just stand out there, and if I finish my job, I look and I listen and I pause, and I always find something new to look at. So that's what I got. So thank you all. And I'm going to get rid of this PowerPoint, and I'll stop my sharing and have a drink of water.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was great. Mind if I take the first question, and then we can go to Anne? I saw her hand up.
Yeah, sure.
You said that the bees, they stick with the same flowers. Would that be day after day after day, or are they going to change from one day to the next?
No, it's a great question, and that's honeybees. I'm not sure what other bees do that flower fidelity, but honeybees will go out and they'll sort of get their agenda in the morning when they go out. If you watch bees closely, they'll orient themselves to the sun when they fly out of the hive and to spiral up, and then they'll go off and they'll forage and they'll come back. And if they find that patch of clover that they were at yesterday and it's still good, they'll probably go back there. But if they find something else that's better, and they say, oh, ooh, there's a whole bunch of good stuff over here, we're gonna, let's go back and do that. So that's it's basically per trip. So they might change, and honeybees have this amazing democracy, if you will, where they will a scout bee will come back and it'll present its case to the collective, which are all female, with the exception of the drones, and that's a whole other interesting parallel of getting things done in my world anyway. And so they come back and they make their presentation to the collective, if you will, and then they decide, what are they going to do? Where are they going to go? What are they going to look for? And then bees have different jobs throughout their life. So the foragers that are actually going out and gathering stuff, they're the ones, is one of the last things that bees do in their life. They only live for about I think it's about 50 days for a honeybee, a regular honeybee. But during the other times of their life, they'll be water carriers or nurse bees or undertakers or guard bees or whatever. So they have different jobs at different points in their lives. But those foraging trips, they tend to be per trip. So a bee will come back with nectar from clover on that trip, and then other bees will be coming back with nectar or pollen from other flowers at the same time. So they're all doing different things, and that diversity is really what's important there.
So then, when they have, like, say, clover honey or another, how can they separate the different kinds of honeys?
It's a great question. There's no such thing as a pure honey. So when they get a clover, or what do they call a varietal honey, it will be almost what it is, right? So if they blueberry honey is a good example. So they will extract honey after the bees have been put in a blueberry a field for days for the pollination. Then that nectar that they gather during that time and create honey, that will be blueberry honey. So they'll extract that as blueberry honey. That does not mean that there isn't other types of nectar in there, and it's a guarantee that there would be, but it'll be predominantly the majority of it, the vast majority of it would be blueberry. And you can taste it. You know, the different types of honeys are good. You know, blueberry honey is one, but raspberry honey is another one that's very floral, or lavender honey. And again, they're in fields where they're almost all of that one type of flower, and they extract the honey from that that nectar from that time.
Cool. And you're mute. Unmute yourself.
I have a question about deer spray. Peter, you said that bees go by sense of smell. Does the deer spray mess them up?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. You're talking about like for to keep deer off of
Yeah.
yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, if I didn't do it, I wouldn't have any flowers.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So I don't know. Do you put I guess the question I'd turn the question back to you and say, if you put deer spray on the flowers, are you still getting bees on it?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I don't know the precise answer to that. It would be something that I'd be interested to learn more about. Because I know, we have so many deer that we can't have an open garden. We fenced it in the way I did.
Right, same here.
Yeah. And so that was the way that we could keep the deer out and keep the flowers, keep some flowers.
I have one other question, which is about hornets and wasps.
Yeah.
Are they all pollinators too? I just did an article about European hornets.
Yep. I think that they might do a little bit. It's not really their thing. Hornets and wasps tend to be predatory, carrion, and they don't collect nectar, and they don't. Although I do see, I shouldn't say that, because I do see wasps on flowers. I don't see them collecting pollen, but I do see them getting nectar, or unless they're getting something that I'm not seeing, like a really, really tiny insect. But they also, sort of interesting general rule, and there's no exact on any of this, is that you can tell the difference between a bee and a wasp, a yellow jacket, and a honeybee, for example, is by the fur, because bees tend to have sort of furry bodies, and that is where they get that pollen gets stuck on their fur, and they carry that intentionally and unintentionally to other flowers. They store it on their back legs, but a lot of it will get on their fur, and then it get knocked off at the next flower, and so that's really how it works.
Okay.
And hornets and wasps tend to be shiny and hard-shelled.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, this is, oh, go ahead. Well, this is Todd. I'm kind of confused about this idea of pollen and nectar. I mean, in other words, they're collecting both.
Yes.
And so so then when they get back to the nest, they scrape off the pollen?
Yes. Yep.
And the nectar they put somewhere else.
Yeah, so there's some I don't want to say, honeybees have what's called a honey stomach, which is a special stomach that they gather the nectar in, and when they slurp up the nectar, it goes in their honey stomach, and then in that they start to add enzymes and stuff like that. When they get back to the hive, they will transfer that, they'll regurgitate that, which is why some people mistakenly say bee vomit, which is not true. They'll regurgitate that nectar, transfer it to other bees who will add more enzymes to it and different enzymes to it in the process, and then that goes in a cell, and then they essentially dehydrate it, because nectar is very watery, and honey is really honey when they cap the comb. It gets down to a moisture content of less than 18%. and then it's considered honey. And as a beekeeper, you know it's honey when it's capped, and then it's basically, once it's capped, it's good forever. And the pollen, they carry on their back legs, and like some of the pictures in their little saddlebags, or I think the correct word is curbicula, on their back legs, there's little saddlebags, and they'll bring that back, and then that becomes, they turn that into something called bee bread, and they'll mix that with some nectar and store that also in cells, and they use that to feed young bees, and that becomes an essential nutrient for young bees to feed on, and that's why they have to have both. They're both essential. The proteins from the pollen and the carbohydrates from the nectar, and that's what makes up the bee diet.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
So then why does a bee move on from one flower? Why doesn't it just stay on one flower until it gets its fill?
It's a good question. It's a great question, actually, because I think and this is the genius of the natural world, is that when a flower only will release a certain amount of nectar, it's not an endless stream. It'll produce a little bit of nectar, and they'll grab it, and they'll move on and grab it, and then the flower will release more. And there's also so once they get their little dab their brush in it, so to speak, and move on to the next one, the flower will produce more nectar. And so that's why the flower does that. And then the bee will gather from a bunch of different flowers, because it's they're very efficient, and they want to get as much as they possibly can, on one trip.
So the flower is trying to get the bee to leave behind some of the pollen from a different flower.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, that's an essential part of it. That's that mutually beneficial thing, where that's what the flower gets out of it, is they get that pollen, which they need to reproduce, that they may or may not, depending on the flower, be able to get from their own flower. So they get it from the bees or carriers, and they bring it from one flower to another.
Oh,
And what role does the nectar play then?
Oh, the nectar is just flowers
For
produce
the
nectar.
flower.
Yeah, for the flower, the flower produces nectar as a way to attract bees. It's bait, really, but then the bees take the nectar and then make honey. But it's also the nectar that they need as their carbohydrate that they need to. It's basically just energy.
How does the pollen and nectar transform into honey?
Well, they gather the nectar in their honey stomach, and they regurgitate it, and then they transfer it to another bee in the hive, and then it goes in a cell, and then it's just a matter of dehydrating it. They fan it to basically dehydrate the nectar, and in the process, it's through the enzymes that they add to it, it's converted to honey. It's pretty crazy.
Magic.
Yeah, it really is.
I have a question. I know that honeybees will swarm every once in a while. They'll split into two colonies. Do other bees do that, or is that just unique to honeybees?
That's a great question. I think that I don't know. I don't know for sure. I can't think of another bee that does that. I think that other bees tend to expand their territory by sending out, like bumblebees will send out new queens that they produce, and they'll start their own little mini colony. But honeybees, for anybody who doesn't know this, a honeybee swarm is the way a hive will naturally reproduce or split. And so they will they'll say and it can happen for a lot of different reasons, but it usually has something to do with the space in the hive. When they get to that point where there's like not enough room, and they say, all right, it's time to move out. So they'll raise new queens. The old queen will leave with half of the hive. So it's not good for a beekeeper, because you lose half your workforce unless you can capture them and put them in a new hive. And then the new queens will they'll fight it out until one becomes dominant. First one out will try and go sting the other ones that haven't emerged yet, and then that hive will stay. That colony will stay where it is. So that's a natural way that the hive split, the honeybee colony is split. And a lot of beekeepers, I'm sorry. Oh, a lot of beekeepers get, it's on my own echo. Anyway, a lot of beekeepers, oh, that's weird. I have an echo on this. A lot of beekeepers get really upset with swarms because you, as I said, you lose half of your workforce. I tend not, me personally as a beekeeper, I tend not to get really upset about it because it's another colony that, depending on the time of year, is going to, you know, get out there genetically and find a new home, and hopefully another beekeeper will get them. But they're very, it's an interesting thing about swarms is that they're very docile when they swarm, and what they'll do is they will come out and they'll fly up in a big cloud. And we had a swarm this year. I heard it in the backyard, and I looked up in the tree. I could see the bees come out of the hive, and they gathered up in the tree on a branch. It was too far for me to reach. And then what they do is they do that same democratic approach where they'll send out scout bees to look for a new habitat. And so the scout bee will look out, you know, we'll have a scout bee that'll go over and look at a, you know, hole in a tree, and then come back and present it to the collective. Or another one will find a barn, has a hole in the barn siding, and say that's a good place to live. I put a bait hive out as a way to encourage a swarm, not encourage a swarm, but to capture a swarm. And then when they come back, they make that presentation to the rest of the bees while they're out up hanging in a tree somewhere, and they'll decide as a group where they're going to go, and then they go. And I'm sure people have seen that kind of cartoon look of a swarm of bees. It kind of looks like that, but they're very docile, and you can we've collected swarms without a bee suit at all. If you can capture it, if it's on a bush, we had one that swarmed on a birch tree in our yard, and I was able to bend the birch tree down and basically shake it right into an empty hive, and they went there. And so I sealed it up and moved it away, and then moved it back so they would get sort of disoriented about their location. But they're not really aggressive at that point for a couple of reasons. Number one, their priority is that they're looking for a new home, and number two, they gorge themselves with honey before they leave, because they're going to need some time to build new comb and feed themselves, you know, in that interim time while they're moved out. And so they're very docile. So if you see a swarm, call a beekeeper and don't be afraid. So
I have a question. The native bees, they're not making honey. So what are they doing with all the pollen and the nectar?
yeah, it's a good question. They're doing essentially the same thing. They make you know, like some of the like leaf cutter bees is one I'm thinking of, that they will cut a little piece of a leaf and they'll use it as a wall in between different eggs for the queen lays for the next generation. But what they also put in there is they put in there a little ball of pollen to feed the egg and the larva when it comes out before it emerges. Bumblebees make a honey-like substance, but it's not edible. So they do some variation of different things, but they get nectar for energy and pollen for reproduction. Then it's usually basically a meal that they leave behind for the next generation.
Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, this feels like it may be a stupid question, but I'll ask it anyway since we're among friends. Do bees travel only during the daylight hours, or only during sunny days? Do they stay in the hive at night?
It's actually a great question. And so these honeybees respond to light and temperature and weather, right? So they generally do not fly at night. It's not their choice. They will, and they will sting you at night. If you go out and knock on the hive, they will come out and investigate who you are. But they typically, because they orient themselves to the sun, that's their navigational system. So when they're out foraging is during the daytime. Interestingly enough, with the farmers and the commercial beekeepers, when they move their bees, they do it at night, because all the bees, honeybees, go back to the hives at night, and then they basically pack up the hives, they load them on the truck, and then they move them off to another place. And as long as they keep moving or they unload them at night again, then then they'll come out in the morning, orient themselves to this new location, and go off and do their work. So yes, they do respond to daylight and night. So you don't really see bees out at night unless they're being tormented or aggressive or whatever. I had a wasp nest that and they're the same thing. I spray them at night if I have one that's in a bad place. I had one right in our wood pile. I wanted to get rid of it, so I went out at night and sprayed it. And that's also with the pollinators film that I did. We did a lot of shooting at night because that's when they move bees. And it was what was great about that story is that most people don't realize that, because these truckloads of bees are moved in and out of locations, farm fields, orchards, whatever, in the middle of the night. And so a truck just going down there at night unloads the bees and then they're gone. So a lot of people don't even realize that happens. And they don't fly usually in the rain. They tend to get back to the hive. They know when it's going to happen, when you're going to have bad weather before we do. But also bumblebees they are known to, if they get caught out, because they don't live in a big colony, they'll tuck underneath a leaf or underneath a flower and hang out. And sometimes you'll see them early in the morning, you'll see bumblebees caught just hanging out overnight underneath the flower. And then the temperature is important. Honeybees don't fly if it's like below 50 degrees, sometimes 45, you'll see them out flying, but they're about 50 degrees. Other bees can operate a little bit colder weather, like bumblebees can fly in colder weather. So you'll see them out sometimes a little bit before the honeybees are. So it really depends on the type of bee. It's actually a great question. So.
Deb?
Yeah.
You can.
Yeah, my question has to do with the location of a hive.
Yeah.
So we have a barn that has definitely had active hives in it, but then they seem to leave and then they seem to come back. We also have another hive elsewhere on the property, and which is in a bee box, I guess it's beehive, and that was purchased for that purpose. Anyway, so do you think it's the same bees that are coming back to the building, or it's a new group of bees that have found it? I mean, there's certainly other places they could go, but I'm curious.
It's unlikely that the same bees would move back and forth like that. It's more likely that it would be descendants of some of those bees or a swarm of some of those bees. But I think the fact that they keep on going back to the barn tells me that they like it there, that it's a good location for a home. If you stop to think about it, the way a bee sees, they see a knothole in a barn. It's about the right size for a bee entrance, and then you get into this protected chase between usually a wall or two sides of a wall, and then the joists, or the studs, so it's a nice cavity for bees to build their comb up. I'm guessing that there's a lot of things that are affecting bees, and one of them is varroa mite, which is a parasite. And so I'm guessing that, and they're very host specific, so they die when the bees do. And so it's possible that you lost those colonies that were in the barn and then no longer there to a varroa mite or some other bee disease. And then other bees discover it and say, hey, this looks like a good home, particularly if there's comb in there. They might use that. So it could be descendants of the same ones, or they could be subsequent swarms or whatever. So yeah, there might be honey in there. I see that in your question. So that could be, you'd have to dig in there and find out.
Yeah, well, we might do that because we're thinking about renovating that space.
Yeah.
So we might have to do it when there's no bees, because we can literally hear them when
Yeah.
we're up there right next to the wall, of course. Yeah. And my other question was, how shallow is your shallow bowl?
Oh, it's funny, what it was is we found it at our old house, and it was it's a stone bowl cut out of granite that we found buried at our old house. We don't know what it was. I've never been able to anybody determine what it was. It's about 6 inches deep at the deepest, and I think they probably used it for grinding juice from berries or something way back when. And so it's no more than 6 inches deep, but you can use a pie pan or something like that with pebbles in it would be fine too.
Okay.
And it, like with that, they, you know, they'll, if they, bees are, I've noticed that they find, they'll look for nutrients. So we have a bag of peat moss is left over that was opened up, and I've been noticing a lot of bees going in there, and they're getting this year they're getting a lot of moisture, but there's something in there because there are other sources of water. There's something else in there that they want, and I of course I would never be able to know what that is, but it's some sort of nutrient or enzyme or something that they're getting off the peat moss that they're liking, because if they find they need minerals and stuff that they in their diet, so they'll go to mud. Sometimes you'll see them on a mud puddle, sometimes you'll see them on, I've seen them on lettuce leaves or whatever, you know, kind of oddball places, but they're doing something there that they need. It's not necessarily just water.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right, I have one. I have so many of them.
That's good. That's what happens.
When can you safely clean up your garden? Can you cut the stalks and leave them laying on the ground? And when can you cut down the stalks?
That's a good question. You know, what I tend to do is I tend to not do it in the fall. I know some people like to clean their gardens at the fall, and I tend not to do that. I tend to let it go a little bit feral over the winter, and then when new stuff starts coming up, I take them in, and then I generally put them, I compost it all. So I generally take all the stalks from, like, just thinking about what I have, from daylilies or monarda or whatever, and I take all those stalks and I kind of put them in a compost pile. There's not that if there are bees in there, they can find their way out, you know, can get out. So that's what I do. So I would say spring is when the
Yeah, like when you say like they have no mow May, so like by the end of May you can safely clean up the beds and kind of get ready.
Yeah, I would look for an indication
Once
of
the
when
bees are out.
Yeah, once you start seeing the bees, once you start seeing the bees coming out, they'll you know, what a lot of bees do, a lot of the native bees, is you'll start to see the drones first, because the way a lot of the solitary bees lay their eggs is they'll lay them in a tube or whatever, and so it'll be female, 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 queen, 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 and then the last eggs that she'll lay are male, and then because those males are first ones out, so they're out and ready when the opportunity knocks the next spring for when the females start to emerge to perpetuate that cycle. So that's a system that some bees have. So I noticed that with carpenter bees, I see the male carpenter bees before I see the female carpenter bees.
How do you tell the difference between the two?
Look very closely, John. No, no, you can tell the difference with identification, and with bumblebees sometimes it's the size. It's hard. I have to confess, it is hard with some of the bees, some of the native bees, to tell the difference. With honeybees, it's pretty easy. There's only one queen in a hive. They're almost all the rest are female, and they're much smaller. And then the drone honeybees have they're a little bit bigger. They're smaller than the queen, but bigger body than the workers, and they have big eyes, and which is great. So you can spot them pretty easily, and that's because they mate in flight. And so they have these things called drone congregation areas, where the drones, who do basically their only role is to mate with a queen, not their queen, but a queen, to perpetuate the genetic diversity. And so they have these drone congregation areas in different parts, and some of them are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, in the same place, where the drones will fly out and fly there and then wait to see if a queen comes by, and then they'll madly try to mate with her. And they may never mate in their lifetime, but that's what they do. So it's kind of cool. So their eyes are really big, and then this time of year, or starting this time of year, because they don't perform any useful roles within the hive, they get booted out. And so they will keep a few of them around, but this time of year, you're starting to see, in the next month or so, you'll start to see drones being not allowed back in the hive by the guard bees, because they say, you know, this guy doesn't do anything all winter. He just eats, and just takes up room. We don't need them. We can raise more when we need them. And so it's a cruel world out there in the insect world.
We're gonna have to wrap it up here. Oh, go ahead, Kim.
Hi, Peter.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
I'm good. So I'm a beekeeper and a gardener too, but in Boston. And I gotta say, every time I hear another beekeeper talk, I still learn something every time, even though I've been doing this for years. So thank you.
Yeah.
It was so much
Me too.
information. But right, exactly. I remember you're right, though. We could talk on and on. But my question was about the pollinators pathway. That is so interesting to me. And I was just wondering about that because I'd never heard of that. And is that something that you're just doing in your community, or have you heard of it outside? Like, I'd love to find more about that in Boston. Have you heard?
Yeah, they're all over the country. They're different places and they're different chapters. Like our town of Rochester, Eckerd ECC signed on to do it. It's a volunteer thing, and then you take an area and you sort of sign on to do it. But I know that there are different pollinator pathways all through Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, in different communities. And
It's very easy too, very easy.
Yeah.
You can go online and look up pollinatorpathway.org or something like that, and
Yep.
get your local. They're a very supportive organization.
It's a great community building thing. I know, if you or anybody else has been keeping bees for a long time, it's really changed over the last 10, 15 years, that this awareness about pollinators is just really exploded. And so, of course, kids, you can hear from kids, they'll talk about bees all day long and know a lot more. And I think they bring it home to their parents. And it's a conversation over dinner tables. And so and I think the pollinator pathway is a really great awareness organization, and it's a networking organization among people as well as bees. And it's just an amazing idea, a concept, to think about these different corridors and connected areas, pathways from town to town, region to region, that's beneficial for the bees.
So, Peter, you said you were going to show some resources. So if you want to show that real quick on the screen, but if anybody wants to see more of it or wants to get a copy of it, you can send an email to thirdthursdayseries@gmail.com, or you can send an email to Peter Nelson.
Yeah,
And can you maybe share your screen, show us what
yeah, let me see if I can do this.
some way to let everybody know what your email
Yep.
is. Okay, here we go.
Here it is. Let me get out of that. All right, so this is my caveat, it's a very incomplete list of resources, and it's kind of long. So if people are interested in this, you can just email me, which is peternelsondp@me.com. I'll put that in the chat. And then I'm happy to share this list, which is totally a work in progress. So see, so that, okay, there it is. And so this list is, can everybody see that all right?
Yeah, scroll down a little bit.
Okay, yeah, so this is it has a little bit of information about the pollinators if you haven't seen it. But then, excuse me, this is bias for Ulster County, in specific this part of Ulster County, for some resources locally around here. But then I also, and I would recommend to people, what goes along with the awareness about pollinators is also the awareness about pesticides. And I would really avoid buying plants and trees at a big box store, because more often than not, they're treated with neonicotinoid pesticides, which will kill not only bees, but a lot of other things. So always ask those questions. And if they can't answer it, don't buy it. But then bees and beekeeping, there's the Hudson Valley bees right up the road. They're fantastic. And these are places that we're so lucky to have really, really good resources right here. Catskill Native, Hudson Valley Seed, and then interesting places to visit. Hortus Arboretum right in Stone Ridge, and the Bly is fantastic. Mountaintop Arboretum it's really good for trees and learning about different types of trees. Stonecrop Garden, the SUNY campus is right here, is amazing. And then a bunch of organizations about pollinator pathways in there. Xerces Society is also very, very, very great resource for educational stuff, pamphlets, and they also are now the parent of Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA. Excuse me, Bee Conservancy, Pollinator Partnership, Arbor Day Foundation, because they have really good information about trees. So this is a good start, I think, for resources. So if anybody just wants me to send me an email, I'd be happy to share this with anybody. And seed companies, these companies are really good for broad meadow or roadside. If you want to do a roadside planting, very, very, very knowledgeable. And then I linked to a few lists of plants and trees that I like and places that have lists, and then some trees that I like for that grow right around here, that are very good. And yeah, and I one of the things that I do is, like, every year I usually buy some trees and shrubs from either Cornell or Audubon, and you get a stick. If anybody has ever seen those, it looks like a pencil thin stick, not even a pencil. And what I do, my method is to make it survive and extend it, is I pot it up for a couple of years and let it develop some roots and grow, and also makes it easier to protect it. So I have a couple of little tree nurseries, if you will, on our property that we grow, and then I plant them, a couple of years down the road. And so you can get some really good shrubs, flowering shrubs that are good for all of nature from the DEC. They do packages like that, and then also Cornell has some great stuff. Couple little books that I like that are good, and yeah. And again, if anybody wants that list, I'm happy to share any of it with anybody who wants it.
All right, thanks a lot.
Yeah, I think it really good.
Joe, all right.
It flew by. You guys are a great audience. So
Yeah, it did fly by.
yeah, so to speak. Yeah.